Wow, well, I guess it's that time again already, huh? Lethal Company is a game that I've talked about a lot of times on this channel. It's one of the most engaging and replayable horror games I've experienced in a long time, and I feel like a lot of others hold a similar sentiment, which is probably why the title that most saw as a passing fad has, against all odds, managed to really stick with many, and has become a mainstay not only on this channel, but also just in general for many people. When I first started playing this game, I knew it had some serious potential, hence why I made an hour-and-a-half long iceberg video about it, but I didn't really expect it to grow and evolve as much as it has in the span of less than a year. Now we've reached the point where the story and lore of this game is no longer a fringe part of the experience, with many more people taking interest in the game's storyline since the release of version 50 in April, and many more undoubtedly paying attention with the shadow drop of version 60 just a couple of weeks ago. Unlike previous updates, version 60 came completely by surprise for many of us. There was no indication of its existence in the public beta, no big new features that were eminently being hinted at, and of course, no trailer preceding the launch on Zeeker's YouTube channel, as has largely become tradition at this point. Nope, instead, the update just kinda dropped on August 17th, and that was that. Now there were some elements or features of version 60 that had been alluded to at some point in the past, particularly the new mineshaft interior, but by and large, my initial perception here was that there didn't seem to be a whole lot of new story elements to talk about, and before I first booted up the update for myself, I wasn't really planning on making a video about any part of it at all. But then, I was greeted with something that I didn't expect. For this new version brings along with it one new element that's not related in any way to gameplay features or mechanics. If you're a more casual viewer, you might have glossed over this entirely, but I think there's a case to be made that the new opening cinematic might present us with some of the most interesting concepts and potential hints at future content that we've yet seen in Lethal Company. And it just might hold the key to understanding some of the game's most enigmatic topics. So today, we're going to be diving headfirst into both of the cutscenes that have been released in Lethal Company thus far, examining them in obsessive detail and theorizing about what they might be trying to convey. This is a topic that's long overdue, so let's finally tackle the mysteries of Lethal Company's opening cinematics. Now before we get into the nitty-gritty of these scenes themselves, I think it's important to provide a little bit of context for anyone who might not be quite up to speed. For most of its lifespan, Lethal Company has been a very simple game. For the first several months after its public release, Zeekers, the game's creator, introduced a number of version updates that, at most, would introduce a few new creatures, items, set decorations, and of course, small improvements to gameplay systems. It wasn't until the release of version 50 in April that we'd see the first of what are now considered major updates. These larger content additions contain many of the same elements as their counterparts, but also tend to introduce content or systems to the game that are a little more involved or complex. In version 50, not only were there a whopping 3 new monsters added, well, technically 4, but if you know, you know, but it also brought 3 new moons or maps to the table, and it was also in this major update that Zeeker slipped in the first ever cinematic this game has ever had. This short segment was only viewable a single time when first launching the game with the new version installed, and so many were taken aback by its inclusion and didn't manage to record or screen cap it on their first try. Eventually though, people figured out that by wiping all of the game's files, including save data from your computer, and reinstalling it from scratch, you could view this thing over again. So there were some copies uploaded to YouTube at the time. Nowadays though, since version 50 is no longer publicly available without Steam console commands, to view this scene in particular, you're going to need to enlist the help of mods. And I would recommend the aptly named Replay Cinematics by Just Ramen. It is the only way I've been successful in capturing version 50 scene footage for myself to use in this video today, and it can be used to replay version 50 and 60's cutscenes without reinstalling the game, so that is certainly nice. I'll have a link to it in the description, as I think it's kind of an essential addition to anyone who's interested in the lore of this game. But now that we have a handle on how these things work, it's time to actually examine them, so we're going to take a look at each of these scenes and go through them in detail before we pick them apart and see if we can derive exactly what's going on between them, why they're here, and why they're so intriguing. The version 50 cutscene opens abruptly when viewing the normal orange boot screen that plays when first starting up the game. There's a jostling or jolting effect that's actually really cleverly integrated into the scene, as it appears to take our character out of the work that they're doing behind the computer, revealing a room that looks a bit like an office or a reception area. We're sitting or standing stationary behind a desk, and we're unable to move around the environment, with the sole exception of swiveling our head in order to take a look around. On our desk is a flashlight pointed toward a door to the left-hand side of the room, and directly in front of us is a window of sorts, which appears to be looking into a separate, connected area, some kind of holding cell or concrete chamber in which there's a monster, a coil head to be exact, placed upon a chair near the back wall. No sooner do we get over the shock of the shaking room than another jolt happens, this one evidently larger than the last, which causes the power to cut out. But just before it does, we see the coil head falling forward. When the emergency lights come on, a long stretch of screaming can be heard just beyond the door. After several seconds of this, a doorway of some kind is revealed behind us, bathing the room in yellow-gold light before the cutscene abruptly ends and we're brought to the main menu. Now, before anyone asks, because I probably used it in the thumbnail, yes, in the earliest version of this cinematic to exist, there was in fact the silhouette of a mysterious, shadowy figure that was plainly visible here at the end, but this was actually removed from the scene while it was still in the beta phase. This version never saw an official release in the main branch of Lethal Company, and it does not exist if the scene is recompiled in the game today, as you can see for yourself if you mod it back in. I am still going to touch on the potential implications of this figure near the end of the video, but just know it's probably not canon, so make of that what you will. Regardless though, it probably doesn't take a lot to figure out the brunt of what's going on here. Clearly, this is some kind of facility, which, judging by the restrained coil head in the other room, seems to be conducting some kind of research on the species. I've seen some people say that they think they can hear the sounds of other types of monsters in the hallways intertwined within the screaming section, with the most commonly referenced creatures being nutcrackers, more specifically the firing of their shotguns, and brackens. But having sat and listened to this many times now, I can sort of hear the bracken, but it's not a pronounced enough sound for me to place a whole lot of stock in it. Here, I'll play it now. Here's the reference noise. And here's the closest thing I found within the cutscene. The nutcracker, on the other hand, I can hear a little bit more so, especially if the volume is low or if the audio itself is low quality. But if you listen closely, I think you'll find that the noise in question, which sounds like this, is actually just a muffled version of a coil head noise. Now, the obvious question to ask is why such creatures would be here in the first place. Coilheads pose a serious threat in-game, and seem like the type of thing humanity would be less than keen to interact with, could it be helped. But for those of you that have read the bestiary, or if you're someone who just watches my channel a lot, you'll know that there's something about these monsters that sets them apart from many of the other species of hostile creatures in-game. That being that coilheads are probably man-made. The bestiary states, Vir colligerus, or colloquially named coilheads, are a recent discovery and have not been studied extensively due to their extreme unpredictability and dangerous properties. They've been known to combust into flames when being dissected or even deactivated, and they carry dangerously high levels of radioactive particles. Due to this and other reasons, it has been highly speculated that they were created as biological weapons of war, although this has not been proven. It's at this point that we sort of have to step out of the realm of what we can tell definitively from evidence in the game, and instead start to do a bit of theory work if we want to come to any sort of conclusion about this scene. But in my opinion, seeing a coilhead in a facility like this, regardless of why it's here, definitely seems to corroborate the assertions made in the bestiary. My personal assumption at this point is that what we're seeing is indeed one of the facilities where coilheads were produced at some point in the past, but where a breach of containment due to unknown means led to a rather harrowing set of workplace accidents. And while all of this seems to line up pretty well on its own, the real nail in the coffin for me comes from an element of this scene that we haven't even talked about yet. If we turn to the right when the cutscene starts, we'll see a calendar hanging from the wall of the room, denoting the month as being October. And although the calendar itself is kind of strange since it has only 6 days to a week instead of 7 as you would expect, someone has very conveniently marked off each day until the present with a nice red X. And as luck would have it, there are 14 X's drawn so far. So just like that, we have our month and date, October 15th. But we're still missing the most important part here, the year. year. And to figure that out, we have to take a step back for a second and talk about Sigurd. The misadventures of Sigurd and his crew is a topic that's brought up in every single one of my Lethal Company videos, so I'm just going to give a sort of Cliff Notes rundown of the whole scenario to make sure that we're all on the same page, as I imagine most of you have heard this spiel before. Throughout Lethal Company, when exploring various moons, there are a number of VHS tapes that can be found, and if collected, their contents can be reviewed by punching Sigurd into the ship's terminal. The final log is a culmination of a massive storyline taking place hundreds of years before the events of the game, where our 4 crew members, Sigurd, Desmond, Jess, and Richard, slowly uncover the sinister secrets of the company before their writings abruptly seem to end, with the final entry being the only log penned by a crew member other than Sigurd, instead being authored by its namesake, Desmond. And as luck would have it, the date that this log was written is October 15th, 1968, the same month and day as presented on the calendar. Could it be that this cinematic takes place on the very same day that Lethal Company's B-plot comes to an end? Now I know that rightfully there are some of you who will remain skeptical here. Couldn't it just be that this random calendar asset and the date of the log just happen to be the same? And the answer to that ultimately is yes, it could certainly be sheer coincidence. But what makes this line of reasoning interesting to me is not just that the date of October 15th appears in 2 seemingly disparate places, but also because Sigurd's logs offer us some insight into why there could have been a demand for coilhead production at the time. And for that, we have to go back to the entry directly before Desmond chronologically, entitled Real Job, in which Sigurd writes the following. I miss Dad. I hope he isn't staying on Titan. People are saying it's not going to look the same in 2 years. Jess told us they are about to go to war, and everybody is just waiting for it. So, the moon Titan is on the precipice of war in October of 1968, which just so happens to be the same month as the calendar in the cutscene, where weapons of war are seemingly being manufactured. That definitely doesn't seem like a coincidence. I think we've pretty much got the purpose of this facility nailed down at this point, and the final thing about the calendar that you may have noticed is that it also highlights October 23rd with a large red circle for some reason. I'm not sure exactly what that's about. It would stand to reason that given the war theory that we've outlined thus far, the circle might indicate the day that the production of these coil heads is supposed to be completed, and or the day that the war on Titan is scheduled to begin. I don't really know about this though, so let me know in the comments if you think this makes some degree of sense, or if you think that the 23rd has some other greater significance. And so we arrive at the last major point of interest regarding this cutscene that I want to touch on before we move on, and it's something that is definitely going to come back up again when we discuss version 60. It's time to talk about the secret message. After the yellow gold doorway opens and the scene cuts, there are several seconds where we can see some lightly transposed text over the black background. It can be a bit tough to read on its own, so I've gone ahead and added brightness and contrast for the sake of the viewing experience, and when enhanced, we can clearly make out the words, "I promise that I'm going. I'm not staying." This won't make much sense now, but keep it in mind as we move forward. For several months, this cinematic from version 50 was the only cutscene of its kind to exist in Lethal Company at all, and with the release of version 55, which didn't include anything of the sort, I think many people just sort of moved on and forgot about this, myself included. But as we already know, version 60 would pick up right where version 50 left off, and with a scene that I don't think anyone was expecting. The version 60 cutscene opens in a very similar way to the previous one, with a new kind of glitch appearing during the boot screen before we're thrust into the perspective of an unnamed character floating, terrifyingly, through the empty vastness of space. Just like the previous cinematic, we can look around, but we aren't in any control of our actual movements, so all that we're able to do is sit here and stare into the abyss as low oxygen warnings repeatedly flash across our screen. Over the course of around a minute, our vision becomes hazy and seems to darken against the already mostly dark backdrop of deep space, an indication that we're beginning to lose consciousness due to asphyxiation. And as a somber track kicks on in the background, our fate seems largely assured. That is, until a door appears in front of us, out of nowhere. Our character slowly drifts towards it, and as they do, a familiar yellowish gold hue is seen peeking through the cracks before the door opens and the cutscene ends with the character beginning to remove their helmet. Obviously, this cinematic is a bit more sparse in terms of information we can derive directly from it, despite it being over double the length of the previous sequence. Unlike version 50's cutscene, we don't have a lot of environmental factors to examine in this one, since, well, there's not much environment at all, so to speak. But that's not to say that there's no meaning we can draw from it. I'm certainly not the first person to point out that this sequence seems to take place from the perspective of an employee who was recently fired from work at the company after failing to meet a quota. Having this happen in-game results in the airlock to the ship being opened and you and your crew sucked into the vacuum of space. So it seems this is a likely way that someone could end up in this situation. But as I hinted at previously, the real meat of this scene's meaning comes primarily from another set of hidden texts. At two distinct points, parts of a message are viewable on screen for a short amount of time, just like at the end of version 50. The first part can be observed when the player character closes their eyes, blinking away the low oxygen warning in the very beginning of the cinematic. Once again, we can raise the brightness and contrast, causing the following text to present itself. A pardon, a defense, a hole in the fence. To all the weary workers, does it exist? And what appears to be the final part of this message can be viewed for a couple of frames after the door is opened at the end of the cutscene, where, as the protagonist takes off their helmet, we're shown a sentence which simply reads, "There is such a place." So, what does all of this mean? Well, if we remember back to the hidden message at the end of the previous section, and then consider it alongside these two new parts, it imbues it with a bit more meaning. The full text almost reads as a sort of poem of some kind, but I'm less concerned about the structure of the message, and more so what it's actually trying to articulate. In a literal sense, the text seems to allude to a location, a place of salvation for company workers where they can be free of the tribulations and dangers of the job. And evidently, it seems to be written from the perspective of someone who's trying to seek this place out. I promise that I'm going. I'm not staying. Not staying with the company, perhaps. And judging by the context of the rest of version 60, it seems that what's being insinuated is that this place, this salvation, whatever it may be, lies behind this door. And suddenly, with this in mind, both of these cutscenes seem to make a lot more sense. In each instance where we've seen this doorway appear, it's revealed itself to someone in a dire state of danger. In the version 50 cutscene, it's probably only a matter of time before the creatures that have escaped make their way to this room, at which point, well, let's just say we're probably dead. And in version 60, the appearance of this door very similarly appears to us in our time of most dire need. Consider how, as it opens, our character appears to remove their helmet, insinuating a safe environment for them to recover from, or at least breathe, outside of the vacuum of space. In both instances, these characters are given an escape, cheating death in the 11th hour. And what's more is that if this phenomenon does in fact exist to save people from the company, as the passage insinuates, then not only do we have even more assurance that the version 60 protagonist was likely a fired worker, but it also would all but confirm that the facility in version 50's scene is company property. If this is in fact true, and assuming what we've alleged earlier regarding this facility being used to create coil heads for the war on Titan also holds up, then this could hold some absolutely massive implications regarding not only the idea that the company had a hand in producing these monsters, but also that they had a vested interest in the Titan conflict. And if we ask ourselves why this is, then I think one thing becomes pretty apparent. Let's compare Titan to the moon which we know the company presently has dominion over, 71 Gordian. I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that these two locales look very, very similar, both housing a massive megastructural complex, which on Titan we know was used for mining, but which on Gordian is of course used to house the company monster. Could it be then that the company were actually the ones to instigate the war on the moon in the 1960s in order to acquire the massive structure for themselves? Could it be that this moon was first intended to be the place where the cosmic horrors of the company would be hidden away? It's hard to be sure how much of this could be true, but I'll be paying close attention to your thoughts on the matter in the comments. Whatever this door is, whatever power it's beholden to, we're dealing with something of the more anomalous or metaphysical variety here. In both cutscenes, we're shown that this mysterious entrance manifests out of seemingly thin air, or I guess a lack of air in the case of this scene, and at present I don't don't really have any particular thoughts on how that process works. It's quite unlike anything else we encounter in game, so we're definitely in some very untrodden territory here, which can make it tough to rationalize much of anything. Maybe both of these cutscenes are meant to read as taking place parallel to one another. This was one of my initial thoughts, because it would mean that both of these sets of events are playing out far away from the other, potentially on opposite sides of the Thistle Nebula. But the mysterious doorway that we see in each video could be one and the same. This would liken the door to a kind of wormhole, in which stepping through one end would instantaneously and seamlessly teleport you to the other. Maybe this reasoning could even rationalize the appearance of this guy in the earlier cut of version 50's scene, in which case he's just this guy walking on through. This likely isn't entirely true though, because aside from the fact that the silhouette of this character was removed from the finalized version of the scene, there's another big problem with this interpretation that you may have already noticed. It would be completely counterintuitive. What would be the point of the door opening to rescue someone from one untimely fate, only for them to step right through into another? Is drifting off to sleep due to oxygen deprivation in deep space really that much worse than being torn apart by a coil head? It seems like it would be kind of pointless from a storytelling perspective, so we're left with the cleaner assumption that no matter where these doors open, they all lead to the same place. And if that's the case, then the big question that we're left with here is where that is. What is behind this veil of golden light? Sadly, given what we know about the game right now, we have absolutely no indication of an answer to this question. I don't even know if it's really worth theorizing about at this point, simply because the sheer lack of evidence effectively makes any and every interpretation fairly comparable in the realm of legitimacy. Whether you think the door opens to the company building, onto the boat, which is essentially the giant spacefaring mothership of humanity in the lore, or any other place in space that you can think of, your interpretation, at least at this point in time, is just about as plausible as anything else based on the evidence. Something that came to my mind while I was considering the possibilities here is that the doors don't necessarily even need to lead to anywhere in physical space. There's a possibility that they might function more like the anomaly from No Man's Sky, where whatever's inside exists in a sort of pocket dimension that can be traveled to from pretty much anywhere in the physical world, and likewise from which you can access virtually any other physical point. The prospect of this scenario in particular is interesting to me primarily because of the implications it could have for Lethal Company's gameplay. It's easy to imagine a scenario like this opening up the possibility for some meta progression options, which is something that's never really been explored in this game. I'm not sure whether it would be a good addition, but it would definitely be interesting. As I said before though, that's just one of an effectively infinite number of ways to interpret what's going on here. These doors could go absolutely anywhere, or nowhere at all, and the question of what is behind them is, at least in my mind, the biggest blind spot in the entirety of the game's lore right now. So sadly, this is where the story of Lethal Company's cinematics closes, at least for now. And that's pretty much everything that I've got to say about the two cutscenes that we've gotten so far. And so... oh wait, hold on. Wait, the doors aren't the biggest blind spot in the lore? You're saying that people want to identify the company monster more than they want to know what's going on here? Oh, well, luckily for you, I've got some food for thought to offer in that regard as well. As I said in the beginning of this video, the rest of version 60, though interesting, doesn't exactly warrant a whole lore video made exclusively about it. Just read the Maneater bestiary entry and you're essentially caught up. But there is one small occurrence I observed that sent me down a funny little rabbit hole. So how about a little completely unrelated bonus theory here at the end? In the newest update, as many of you will know, there's a new enemy known as the Maneater. Its main gimmick is that it starts off its life as a baby and will cry if it feels threatened or gets scared by something like a loud noise, and if it's not attended to quickly, it'll grow into this thing, which insta-kills you if it catches you. Something that not everyone may know, though, is that the Maneater has a unique interaction with scrap items, unlike any other creature in the game, where if it's set down in front of one, it'll have a 20% chance to eat it every 3 seconds or so, and for every item that it eats, it'll become progressively more engorged, up to 3 times its original size. Now, I want you to think carefully about this. We have a monster that eats scrap, it has to be kept placated through the actions of the player, and this prevents it from growing into a virtually unstoppable killing machine. So my question is simple: who does that remind you of? That's right, you've heard it here first. The company monster is just a big baby, and you can now be prepared to learn all about it in my next video, so be on the lookout for that. It ought to be quite the banger. Not for real though, you gotta admit the similarities are a little bit weird. This joke probably would have been more funny if the next version of Lethal Company wasn't actually introduced for real on the beta branch 2 days before I finished editing this video, but you know, what can you do? Either way though, I hope that this video got you thinking about the sheer strangeness of the Lethal Company cutscenes. Maybe you've got your own thoughts or observations about them that you want to leave me down below. It would certainly be appreciated, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this topic, since it's kind of a confusing and ambiguous piece of the Lethal Company puzzle at this point. I'll try to respond to as many comments as I can, and either way, I hope to see you in the next one. With that though, this is Everberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.